Gloves? Got them. Oh. All right, go ahead and open it. All right, can you remove the top item from that and publish it to the jury? And if you would, could you turn it so this area is the top area? I'm sorry. And
you absolutely, please.
do you recall whether or not that is suspected blood stains that we're looking at or suspected wine stains in that area?
This area here is suspected blood stains.
All right. And so can you direct us to the area where the suspected wine stains were?
At the top here,
And what color does it appear to be to you today?
kind of a yellowish color.
Okay. And is there any other area on this piece of the bedding that had either suspected blood stains or suspected wine stains?
Not that I see.
And did you label or did somebody label any corner of this so that we knew geographically or some directionality?
Yes, I did label it.
All right, and how did you do that?
With a Sharpie, I wrote foot of the bed, east side.
Okay. And so then, if this is the foot of the bed east side, is that going south towards the headboard? Perhaps can you lay it down on the ground?
Yes, I was going to ask that.
Yep.
George, if you need to stand up, feel free to do that. One of y'all want to help her?
I could put on a second pair of gloves.
Oh, it's okay. Yeah. Oh, I thought we had the box up there. It's over here. You just give it a minute, so keep the glove up so he can help you.
Step one is right side up, correct?
Correct.
Okay. All right, so where's the headboard?
Up here in this direction.
And so is this the headboard side, the south side?
Yes.
Okay. And this is the west side?
This is the west side.
And is this the side where Mrs. Ward was found, basically over in the direction past Mr. Gillen?
Yes.
Okay. And the comforter was somewhat folded over, like kind of like hotel service is how I would describe it. Is that accurate? in
Yes,
the photos?
it was folded over.
Okay. All right. Can we go through what else is in the box?
Yes.
All right. Now we at least fold it up, and we'll put it back after the other items. Or bunch it up. What are we looking at here, Ms. Vibert?
This is the pillowcase on the west side of the bed.
And is that the side of the bed with the ThinkPad, firearm, and holster?
Yes.
All right. And is there any discoloration on this pillow still?
Yes.
Can you show it to the jury and describe it?
There
There are stains all over the pillowcase. They are a yellowish orange color now.
And did you mark this in any way for the directionality, or would we have to look at the photos for the open end of the pillowcase?
We would have to look at the photos for the opened end.
Okay. All right. Anything else? Is this the fitted sheet?
Correct.
Okay. All right, and do we know which end is south and north and east and west?
We did not document on the fitted sheet which side was east or west.
Okay. Are there any stains or discoloration on this sheet?
Yes, there are.
And where are they?
There are some stains and discoloration next to my hand on this side, and then you'll also see some at the bottom of the sheet on that side, and a few in the middle.
Okay. All right, you can replace that.
It's on the evidence table so they can glove up when they need to. Thank you.
Just under the table.
Thank you, ma'am.
All right. You can stay gloved. May I approach with P?
You may. P, you said?
Yes, ma'am. Do you recognize the contents of P?
Yes, I do.
All right. Is there also, in addition to what appears to be a firearm, 2 envelopes in there?
Yes, there is.
And can you, without showing the jury, show yourself the contents of the big envelope? What does the label say it is?
K1 from distance tests, and it has a case number on it.
Okay. And can you tell me what is in K1?
Fired cartridge cases.
Okay. And what about what is in the smaller envelope?
It's labeled with the same case number, K1 357 mag Smith & Wesson, serial number, and it's sealed.
And we had an opportunity to open this box and those envelopes recently altogether.
Yes, we did.
Do you recall what's in the little envelope, or do you need to open it?
Could I please open it
Sure.
to confirm?
If you need this, let me know.
They are fired cartridge cases with the projectiles.
And are they said to come from a 357 Magnum?
Yes.
At this time, Your Honor, the state would move P for identification and evidence.
Any objection? This will be received without objection. It states number 20.
May the witness stand down.
She may.
One second. Permission to publish?
Granted.
All right, can you publish the firearm? All right. And can you replace that and show them an empty casing from the bigger envelope? Now, at the I guess, the relative bottom, even though it's the head stamp. Can you tell them what a head stamp is and what it says?
The head stamp is the bottom portion of the cartridge that shows the caliber and typically the manufacturer, and it also has the primer on it. This one says R.P. It's 357 Magnum.
Okay, you can replace that. Then in the smaller envelope, you indicated there was casings with the projectiles.
That is correct.
Were there any live cartridges left in the hole?
I did not see any.
Okay. Can you show them a projectile part of the cartridge? Can you reach over? You can show closer.
Did all of the jurors get to see it? Does anyone need to see it again? All right.
Okay. You can place those items. I'll let you know if I want you to sit down. Showing you W for identification. Do you recognize W for identification?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize it as?
The 4 live rounds in the fired cartridge case that came out of the cylinder of the firearm at the scene.
And when you collected it, did you label it, seal it, initial it?
Yes, I did.
And other than any FDLE tape on it, is in substantially the same condition as when you packaged it?
Yes, it is.
Is this something else that we had the opportunity to view together?
Yes, it was.
All right. Your Honor, at this time, the state would move W for identification into evidence.
Any objections? No objection. This will be received without objection. States 21.
Permission to publish?
Granted.
As sometimes happens, inside the bigger envelope, were there smaller ones?
Yes.
All right. How many?
2.
All right. Do you need it? What's in the first envelope and how is it labeled?
It says FDLE Orlando Crime Lab test used to test fire K1, K2D, test fired and initials, I believe, of the analyst. On the back, it has the same case number as the previous ones. And inside, it's a fired cartridge case.
A single casing?
A single casing, yes.
Okay. What's in the other smaller envelope that was in W, which is 21?
This is labeled as well FDLE Orlando Crime Lab test. The same case number, K2B plus K2C. Cartridge used in distance test, fired with K1 and the initials of the examiner. This has 2 fired cartridge cases.
Okay. So total of 3 fired casings in this exhibit?
In these 2 envelopes.
Okay.
There's additional in this envelope.
Okay.
That's just the top of the envelope when it was cut. There's 1 additional cartridge case and 1 live round.
Can you show them the live round? And you can replace everything, if you don't mind. So to summarize these 5 rounds, 1 was spent as you found it at the scene, is that fair?
That is fair?
And then 3 were apparently spent by FDLE testing,
Yes.
And one live round that was found in that firearm remains.
That is correct.
Hang on. Permission to show the witness you for identification?
Granted.
Do you recognize you for identification?
Yes, I do.
How do you recognize it?
The label with my signature and my writing and my initials on the label for the evidence tape.
And what do you recognize it to be based on that?
A black holster.
Is that the one you collected from the nightstand?
That is, yes.
At this time, the state would move you for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection. States number 22.
Permission to publish.
Granted.
Showing you Q for identification. Do you recognize Q?
Yes.
And what do you recognize it as?
A box of 45 Colt MagTech ammo.
And can you use 45 Colt MagTech ammo in the 357 Magnum we've been handling?
No, you cannot.
Where'd you find this stuff?
I believe this stuff was either in the nightstand in the bedroom or in the office. I'd have to confirm with my report.
And could you go do so?
Yes. The top drawer of the nightstand.
Okay. Did you process this for fingerprints or DNA?
No, I did not.
Why not?
We suspect that either person's DNA that lives in the house could be, or fingerprints could be on it because they both live in the house.
And either way, we just mentioned it, it doesn't go into a 357 Magnum?
That is correct.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move Q for identification and evidence.
Any objections? All right, this will be received without objection. States exhibit number 23.
Showing you R for identification. Do you recognize R for identification?
Yes, I do.
Sorry.
Yes.
What do you recognize it as?
A box of 410 hunting gauge ammo that was found on top of the nightstand in the bedroom.
And we asked earlier, 410, does that go into the 357?
No, it does not.
Did you process this for latents or DNA?
No, I did not.
And if I asked you why, you'd say the same thing?
Yes.
At this time, the state would move R for identification and evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection. States number 24.
S for identification. Do you recognize S?
Yes.
What do you recognize it as?
This is the 357 Smith & Wesson firearm box that was found in the office downstairs.
All right. And collected, packaged, labeled, as we previously discussed.
Yes.
Something we had an opportunity to open,
Yes.
as with the previous exhibits that I didn't ask you about.
That is correct.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move S for identification and evidence.
Any objections? All right, this will be received without objection. States number 25.
V as in Victor for identification. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
Other than being opened by Mr. Stanger yesterday, is it in substantially the same condition as when you last saw it?
Yes, it is.
And what is it?
A black cell phone.
And where was it collected from?
There was a second office behind the first office that I found the firearm accessories at that this was in.
All right. collected, packaged, labeled, similar fashion?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move V for identification into evidence.
Any objection? This will be received into evidence, states number 26, without objection.
Showing you what was X for identification, but is now states 13. Do you recognize this item?
No.
Okay. You had nothing to do with this one.
That is correct.
And it was labeled as the BlackBerry?
BlackBerry, yes.
Okay. Showing you B as in boy for identification. Are you familiar with this item?
Yes.
How are you familiar with it?
It says 1 Islesworth collared shirt, size medium.
And is that something that was collected from anybody?
Yes, this should be the shirt collected from Mr. Ward.
And did you package it, label it, and seal it in a similar fashion?
Yes, I did.
Did we have an opportunity to view this together not too long ago?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move B for identification and evidence.
Any objections? This will be received to states number 27 without objection.
Permission to publish.
Granted.
Can you first show the jury the front? And now the back. And the collar, inside of the collar. Now, can we talk about, if the shirt is facing forward, the suspected stain that was kind of on the front, on what would be the right side? Do you still concur in your opinion that it appears similar to the stains on the back?
Yes, I do.
And what about the stain on the collar that we talked about being suspected blood?
There's not really a stain anymore on here. I believe I did a swabbing of the area.
You can replace B, 27. Showing you C for identification. Do you recognize C for identification?
Yes.
What do you recognize it as?
The pair of shoes that Mr. Ward was wearing.
The Mr. Ward in the courtroom that we pointed out earlier?
That is correct.
Did you collect them at the sheriff's office the morning of the 22nd?
Yes.
And did you package, label, seal in a similar fashion?
Yes, I did.
Substantially same condition as you last saw it, other than any FDLE tape?
Yes.
And did we have an opportunity to see this item as well recently?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move C for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection to states number 28.
Permission to publish?
Granted.
Can you publish the left one first? And the right shoe? All right, you can replace them. Showing you K for identification. Do you recognize K?
Yes.
And how do you recognize it?
They are suspected swabs of suspected blood from the right shoe that I collected.
And again, what areas of the shoe did you swab?
The right shoe,
Any particular areas of suspected stains?
all areas of the right shoe.
Okay. And Ms. Wood was kind enough to demonstrate a Q-tip with a little cardboard box that suspends the Q-tip in air. Did you use that similar kind of thing to take those swabs?
Yes, I did.
And when you were done, did you label it, package it, and seal it in a similar fashion as we've discussed?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE evidence tape, is it in substantially the same condition as when you packaged it?
Yes.
Right. Your Honor, at this time, the state would move K for identification into evidence.
Any objections? All right, this will be received as states number 29 without objection.
D for identification. Are you familiar with D?
Yes.
And how are you familiar with it?
They're the pair of Tommy Bahama plaid shorts and belt that I took from Mr. Ward.
On September 22nd, 2009?
Yes.
After you took them, did you package, label it, and seal it after you examined it at the sheriff's office?
Yes.
As with the other items that you examined there?
Correct.
And is it substantially same condition?
Yes, it is.
Something else that we had the opportunity to view together recently?
Yes.
State would move D for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection as states number 30.
Permission to publish?
Granted?
Could you publish the front of the shorts and belt first? And can you publish the back? Thank you. L for identification. Do you recognize L?
Yes.
What do you recognize it as?
The 2 swabs of suspected blood I took from the pants that you just saw.
And after you collected them, did you package, label, and seal in the same fashion?
Yes.
And aside from FDLE tape, is it in substantially the same condition as when you packaged it?
Yes, it is.
And did we have an opportunity to view that as well?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move L for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received as states 31 without objection.
And we already discussed N, which is state's 11, yesterday. That's Mr. Ward's gunshot residue kit that you took?
Yes, that I collected from Kelly Ward.
Kelly Wood, yes.
Kelly Wood.
That's right, Kelly did that. G for identification. You recognize G?
Yes.
What do you recognize G as?
The swabs I took from the cylinder of the firearm?
And if I get the firearm, can you show me how and where you took that from?
Yes.
Permission to publish 20 again?
Yes, sir.
Can you show them?
This is the cylinder portion of the firearm, the part that rotates. So I swabbed the entire cylinder area.
Labeled, packaged, sealed in a similar fashion?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE evidence tape in substantially the same condition?
Yes.
Your Honor, the state would move G for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection, state number 32.
H for identification. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
And what do you recognize it as?
2 swabs I collected from the grips of the firearm.
And after you collected that, did you package it, label it, seal it in a similar fashion?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE evidence tape, substantially same condition?
Yes, it is.
Something we had the opportunity to see?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move H for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection, states number 33.
Permission to publish 20.
Granted.
Can you demonstrate, when you say the grip of the firearm, what you're talking about and what you did?
I would swab the textured grip area here where you'd be holding the firearm, if you were to be holding the firearm correctly, on this side, and also on this side, the right and the left side.
I for identification. Do you recognize I?
Yes.
What do you recognize it as?
These are swabs I collected from the trigger area of the firearm.
And by trigger area, what do you mean?
The area that you're gonna, the little loop that you're gonna pull back on the firearm that's gonna cause the explosion and the projectile to go out.
And after you collected it, did you package, label it, and seal it in a similar fashion?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE evidence tape, substantially same condition?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move I for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received without objection, at states number 34.
J for identification. Are you familiar with J?
Yes.
And what is it?
Swabs from the interior barrel of the firearm.
And that's the exit point of the firearm?
Yes.
And packaged, labeled, sealed, similar fashion?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE evidence tape, substantially same condition?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move J for identification into evidence.
Any objection? This will be received as states number 35 without objection.
F for identification. Are you familiar with F?
Yes.
And what do you recognize it as?
This is the DNA card I collected from the medical examiner's office of Miss Ward.
And same questions, packaged, labeled, sealed similarly?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE tape, is it in substantially the same condition?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move F for identification into evidence.
Any objection? This will be received as states number 36 without objection.
O for identification, are you familiar with O?
Yes.
What are you familiar with it as being?
This is the GSR kit collected from Mrs. Ward at the medical examiner's office.
And did you label it, package, and seal it in a similar fashion?
Yes.
Aside from FDLE evidence tape, is it in substantially the same condition as when you saw it, when you packaged it?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move O for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received as states number 37 without objection.
T for identification, are you familiar with that?
Yes.
How are you familiar with it?
It says it's the vials containing the projectiles and jacketing that you saw in the pictures previously that I obtained from the medical examiner's office from the victim.
And when you obtained them, did you package, label it, and seal it?
Yes.
And aside from FDLE evidence tape, is it in substantially the same condition as when you did that?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move T for identification into evidence.
Any objections? This will be received as states number 38 without objection.
AF for identification, are you familiar with that item?
Yes.
And what are you familiar with it as being?
The two bags from the right and left hands at the victim that the medical examiner investigator put on at the crime scene.
And are you familiar with AG for identification?
Yes.
How are you familiar with it?
It states it's two bags from the feet from the right and left side of the victim from the crime scene.
And did you collect that from the medical examiner as well?
Yes, I did.
All right, now both of these items, packaged, labeled, sealed,
Yes.
and aside from FDLE evidence tape, and if there is FDLE evidence tape, is it in substantially the same condition as when you last saw them?
Yes, it is.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move AF into evidence and then AG into evidence.
Any objections to either one? No objection. AF will be received as states number 38 without objection,
You can retake your seat.
and AG will be received as states number 39 without objection. I'm sorry, 39 and 40. I knew I missed one. Thanks. AF is 39, AG is 40.
Now, those last two exhibits, 39 and 40, the bags from Mrs. Ward that you collected from the medical examiner's office,
Yes.
did you test the inside of the bags of the hands for GSR?
No.
And forgive me if we did this right before lunch, I just forget. And why not?
We do not do GSR testing on paper bags, clothing, or anything for that matter, except for typically hands.
All right. We did that. Just a couple more questions, and then we'll be done. Permission to publish BB, the diagram of the house for demonstrative.
Granted. All right, it's up.
Ms. Vibert, can you, with the assistance of the technology of the screen, show us where it is the other two firearms and the firearm equipment and stuff was located in the first floor office as you described? And then where was the second office that you described in the house? Okay. Thank you. You can clear it. No other questions?
Crofts.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You've been up here a while.
That's okay.
Just a few more questions from me. Let's start off with an area that you ended up on. Gunshot residue.
Okay.
Are you telling this jury that you cannot test gunshot residue on clothing, yes or no?
Yes,
You're telling the jury that you cannot test.
that is correct.
So it is. Now, where did you form your opinion that you cannot test gunshot residue on clothing?
We have gunshot residue kits that are for hands, not for clothing.
My question is it possible to test gunshot residue on clothing, whether it's with your kit or in another method?
I have not heard of that, no.
Do you know Dr. Stephanie?
I believe she works for the medical examiner's office.
Wasn't she the one who did the autopsy in this case?
I would not know that. I don't work for them.
Okay. Would you disagree with her if she said that you can test gunshot residue on clothing?
You can look for stippling, but I would not test for gunshot residue.
So you would disagree with her on that?
Yes,
Okay. In any event, you didn't do it, did you?
that is correct.
And you didn't ask anybody if it could be done, did you?
Yes, that is correct.
And the same analysis when it comes to the bagged hands. Did you ask anyone whether or not it was possible to test the interior of a bagged hand to find out whether there are gunshot residue particles in there?
No, I did not ask.
Okay. And of course, you know the reason why you used bagged hands is so that anything that would fall off of the victim's hands would be contained within the bag, correct?
That would be for the medical examiner. I believe it's more for blood or fibers or hairs or DNA under the fingernails, not for gunshot residue.
Well, it would be for anything that fell off the hand, right?
Technically, yes.
And you know that gunshot residue is something that can fall off a hand fairly easily, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
All right. And so if gunshot residue were on Mrs. Ward's hands and fell off in the bag, then you're saying that there's no way to retrieve that or to test whether it's in the bag. Is that right?
Well, I'd assume there'd be gunshot residue on her hands because she has a gunshot wound to her body.
Well, you're assuming that she had gunshot residue on her hands?
Typically, someone of a gunshot wound would have gunshot residue on them somewhere.
All right. But you're saying that you are assuming that she had gunshot residue on her hands?
No, I'm saying that gunshot victims typically would have gunshot residue on their body because they just got hit with a bullet.
And what happens is is if someone shoots a gun, then the gunshot residue would go on their hands, correct?
And the surrounding area.
And again, the question is yes or no. When someone shoots a gun, gunshot residue goes on their hands, correct?
Yes, it can.
Okay. Now, when you testified earlier that when Mrs. Ward was in the bedroom on the floor, that you were not permitted, you could not touch her because that was the medical examiner, correct?
Yes, we do not have jurisdiction over the body.
But and then you were asked whether or not you could have done any gunshot residue testing on her hands at that time. Do you remember that question?
That I could do gunshot residue on our hands? I don't believe I was asked that.
Well, what your testimony is that you could not do gunshot residue testing without the assistance or the direction of the medical director. Is that correct?
Yes, that would be correct.
All right. And so what would happen is if you or the lead investigator out there was that Detective Cross,
Yes.
if you or Detective Cross wanted to have gunshot residue testing on Mrs. Ward's hands there at the scene, then you could have requested from the medical examiner that someone from the medical examiner's office come to do that, couldn't you?
That would be up to them to determine. I would not know that answer.
Well, I'm asking you whether or not you and Detective Cross made a request to the medical examiner's office that gunshot residue be conducted on Mrs. Ward at the scene, yes or no?
No, I never would have.
No, you didn't, right?
No, I would not have.
Now, you also indicated that you were asked questions about stippling, correct?
I believe I was, yes.
By Mr. J, right?
I do not recall, but if it was brought up, yes.
Okay. And did you do any examination of Mr. Ward's clothes with a microscope or a magnifying glass to examine his shirt for any particles of stippling when you photographed him and took his shirt from him?
No.
Now, of course, you could have, because that would be a way of determining whether or not there was any stippling on him, correct?
You would be able to visibly see it with the naked eye.
Well, are you aware that with stippling that it's easier to use a magnifying glass to look for small particles of stippling? Are you aware of that?
I'm aware of that for gunshot residue, but not for stippling.
So you're not aware of the necessity for using a magnifying glass in order to find out the density or small particles that would be stippling that could not be visible by the eye?
I have always seen it to be visible to the naked eye.
Well, if you can't see it, then if you think that the stippling is only things that you can see with your naked eye, then of course you could not see stippling that would not be visible to your naked eye, correct?
Well, stippling typically comes from the gunshot wound, and Mr. Ward did not have a gunshot wound on him.
Well, I'm just, please follow me and just answer the questions if you would. Do you agree that if some stippling particles have to be examined with a magnifying glass, so you can't see it with the naked eye, that you did not do that on Mr. Ward's clothing, did you?
No, there was no reason.
So you assume that there was no reason, correct?
There was no gunshot wound.
Well, we're talking about whether or not he had stippling on his shirt or on his pants, and you're saying you ran no test, correct?
Stippling comes from a gunshot wound.
Well, stippling comes from a gunshot going off, correct?
Yes, and it comes from the projectile going into the person or clothing that has the hole, and then there's a stippling effect on that area, not just coming off a firearm.
Stippling goes out in a direction, doesn't it? It's a broader direction, correct?
That would be gunshot residue.
Well, both stippling and gunshot residue. You didn't test for either one on his clothing, did you?
That is correct.
Okay. And you didn't test for either one on Mrs. Ward's clothing, did you?
I don't believe she had a gunshot wound on her shirt.
Well, I'm asking whether or not you tested for gunshot wound, for GSR or for stippling on Mrs. Ward's clothing, yes or no?
No.
Now, when Mrs. Ward was taken to have her autopsy done, and did you go and then examine her clothes then to determine whether or not these additional scientific tests might be capable of being done?
No, we do not attend autopsies.
Well, the clothing is removed from the deceased, correct?
Yes.
And the clothing can either be retrieved by law enforcement and tested or thrown away, correct?
That is correct.
Did you throw it away or was it thrown away?
No, I have the evidence.
Okay. So you have Mrs. Ward's clothing, but you never tested it or ever asked anyone to test it, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Matter of fact, I believe that it's fair to say that at the scene, in terms of what was going to go to the lab and what wasn't going to the lab, that was a decision that you and Detective Cross made, correct?
We typically collaborate together to determine what needs to go, yes.
Okay, I'm talking about that on September the 21st, early morning of September the 22nd, you and Detective Cross were the ones that made the decision about what was going to go to the lab and what wasn't going to the lab, correct?
Not on that day, no.
Well, you ultimately, when did you make the decision? The next day or the day after?
Normally a day or two after we meet together to determine what they have found out from their end and what I have on my end and make that determination of what needs to be sent.
Okay. And so did you have a meeting where you took notes and Detective Cross took notes about the decisions that you would make in the case about what was to be tested and what wasn't to be tested?
No, we don't typically do that.
But you had the meeting, correct?
Yes,
You just didn't take any notes, correct?
that is correct.
So there's no way for the jury to know exactly what was discussed in terms of leads that would be followed and leads that would not be followed, at least from any written documentation. Is that fair?
My report states what we sent and what we decided to send.
But in terms of the discussions that you had with Detective Cross about what was going to go to the lab and what wasn't going to go to the lab, that's something, there's no document that reflects the dialogue between the two of you. Is that right?
No, because it's reflected in my report.
Now, there are a couple of issues that I want to go over with you. Fingerprints. Now, you didn't take any fingerprints, did you?
No, I did not.
The bed in the scene, there were 2 nightstands, correct?
Yes,
Mrs. Ward was on one side of the bed where the gun was found, correct?
that is correct.
And on the other side of the bed, there was a computer open, that was her computer, correct?
It was a computer. I don't recall whose computer it was.
You don't remember opening it up and seeing Diane Ward on the screen?
I didn't open it up. It might have unfroze when taking photos and moving stuff around, but I didn't personally open the computer, no.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the things that you were assuming as an investigator. And you did a lot of assuming that night, didn't you?
No.
Oh, you didn't? Okay. Well, did you assume that the shooting took place on the side of the bed did you assume that was Mr. Ward's side of the bed?
I did not assume it was Mr. Ward's side of the bed. I knew the shooting took place there because the victim was there and all the blood stains were over there.
Okay. So when you were making your determinations about what tests you were going to do and not do, you did not have any assumption about whether that was Mr. Ward's side of the bed or whether it was Mrs. Ward's side of the bed. Is that correct?
I don't think it would matter, no.
Well, I'm not asking whether you think it would matter. I'm asking whether or not you made any assumptions.
No, I did not make any assumption on whose side of the bed it was.
Okay. So if it had been Mr. Ward's side of the bed, then fingerprints become a little bit more important, don't they?
No, they do not.
Well, because the nightstand would be on his side of the bed, correct?
Yes,
And the drawer would be a drawer for his nightstand, correct?
he, yes, could open it, but anyone else could as well.
Well, you're assuming again, aren't you? You're assuming that, well,
Sustained.
I'll rephrase it. What you were doing is you were assuming that Mr. and Mrs. Ward had equal access to every part of the house, didn't you? Well, she
Sustained.
testified to that. Excuse me, Your Honor.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
I'll rephrase. When you were explaining to the jury why you didn't do various tests that were discussed on direct examination, you said that you assumed or you suspected that there wouldn't be any relevant evidence because they would have equal access to the house. Do you remember your testimony?
Yes, I do. They both live there and they're married and they both live in the house.
Okay. Well, just because they live in the same house doesn't mean that they would have equal access to particular drawers or something like, for example, a gun, does it?
Objection, there's two facts not in evidence.
Sustained. Rephrase the question.
Now, did you assume that when you conducted your examination or your investigation that Mr. or Mrs. Ward had equal access to the gun?
To that specific gun or all guns?
that gun.
Objection, there's been nothing in evidence that the gun was in there prior to the shooting.
I'm asking what she's assuming because she told us what she did and didn't do.
I understand where you're trying to get. If you could be specific about the questions, because they can become confusing on the
Okay.
record. All right, thank you.
So you assumed, did you not, that, let's take the gun, for example. Now, is that states 20?
It is.
And where might that be? May I approach the witness with this, Your Honor?
You may. You still have gloves on, right?
No, I can put
Are you
some
going to
on.
ask her to handle the gun?
I'm going to ask her to, if she could come down.
Okay, yeah. I just need her to glove up.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
I need her to put gloves on, that's all.
Okay. First of all, this box, what is this box?
It is the evidence box I used to package the firearm for this case?
Okay, so this was not a box that was found at the house?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, may I open this, or do you need to open it, or how are we going to do this?
You can open it.
Okay. If you would take the gun out, please. Now, what we have here is the gun that you told us about, and you explained to us where it was found, correct?
Where I found it, yes, when I arrived on scene.
Okay. Well, someone had moved it. You thought someone moved it?
I believe CSI Kelly Wood found it in a different location and moved it prior to my arrival, yes.
Okay. Now, what you did is you decided not to run any fingerprints on the gun, correct?
That is correct.
Now, so you indicated that you didn't do that because you wanted to run DNA testing on the gun, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, show us again where you did your DNA testing.
I did the DNA testing on the grips, the cylinder area, which is the main portion of the firearm here, the trigger here, and the interior portion of the barrel, the inside of it.
Okay. What part of the gun did you not run DNA testing on?
None of it. I DNA tested the entire gun.
So when you say the grip, you've got this, and then you did it here, then you also did the cylinder.
Yes.
Okay. And so you made the determination that the DNA testing, you couldn't do both, so you had to make a decision about which one to do. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. If you would put that back. And while you're up here, if we can get Exhibit 22, there, I think, right here. If you would reach in there,
Sure.
grab that.
Okay.
Now, this was the gun holster, correct?
It is a gun holster I collected.
The gun holster that was collected that night, correct?
Yes.
All right. And as it relates to this, there is a flat area here, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Well, I'm sure you ran fingerprints on that to determine whether somebody had handled that and had fingerprints on that, didn't you?
As previously stated, no, I did not test for fingerprints.
So we have an area here. Your Honor, is it permissible for me to hold this, or is it?
You have a glove on, there's a box right over there.
I'm sorry.
There's a box of gloves right there for the attorneys.
No, that's okay. I'll just have her hold it then.
All right, no problem. Thanks.
I don't think they would fit my hand, or they would be too awkward, I think.
They're not pink.
Yeah, I'd like some blue gloves, Your Honor.
They're
No,
gray.
I'm teasing, I'm teasing.
White ones up there.
Okay, so this is an area that you did not test for fingerprints, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And this entire area is an area that you did not test for DNA, did you?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, in the, if you would, to go back to the witness area. So if the gun were in that holster, fair to say that somebody would have to hold the holster to take the gun out? Would you agree with me on that?
Objection, assuming facts not in evidence.
I'm asking a
Sustained.
hypothetical.
Rephrase the question.
If the gun were in that holster, somebody would have to hold the holster to pull the gun out, wouldn't they?
If a gun was in a holster, then yes, they would have to pull the firearm out of the holster to get it out.
Okay. And so that would require somebody kind of gripping it with their hands, as we've seen that holster. And that's the sort of thing in which when someone's gripping something like that, that's exactly where DNA would be left, isn't it?
Yes, technically, if you have the holster on you, though, the grips of the firearm are sticking out, and you would just be pulling from the grips to get your firearm out. It would depend on how the holster was, in whatever circumstance you're talking about, however the holster was laying with the firearm in it.
Well, the holster was on top of the nightstand, correct?
I did find it on the nightstand, yes.
Okay. So it wasn't in anybody's belt. It wasn't in anybody's pocket. It was on the nightstand, the top of the nightstand, correct?
At that time, it was, yes.
All right. Now, when you and Detective Cross were making your determination about what was going to be tested and not tested, did you say, you know, we really need to run a DNA test on the holster, the one that was on top of the nightstand where the gun was found? Did you say that to Detective Cross?
I said that we did not need to.
So you said you didn't. So you made the conclusion and you made the judgment not to test for DNA, right?
That is correct.
Now, the DNA, very, very. You felt it was very, very important in the case, didn't you?
The DNA?
Yes.
I believe the detective felt it was very important in the case.
As a matter of fact, I'm going to ask if you would agree with this statement. Do you agree with the statement that
Objection, I have no idea what he's reading from, but I suspect it's not in evidence.
I'm going to ask her whether she agrees with the statement.
What, you need to identify the document you're reading from. You can't just read a statement to her.
Reading from her testimony in a prior proceeding.
Okay.
Improper predicate for impeachment.
Sustained.
Not impeaching her. I'm asking her whether she agrees with the statement.
Let me see the attorneys at sidebar, please. Standing and stretching is allowed and recommended. You may proceed, Mr. Gill.
Thank you, Your Honor. what you really wanted to do when you ran the DNA test on the gun is you really wanted to find out who exactly fired the firearm, correct?
Yes, I wanted to find out what major portion of the DNA was on the trigger area.
Because the trigger area would tell you whose DNA was on there and who pulled the trigger, correct?
Technically, no.
Well, that's what you wanted to know. You wanted to know whose DNA was on the trigger, right?
The detective wanted me to find that out, yes.
And you felt, didn't you, that it was very, very important in terms of all the DNA, the DNA that existed on the trigger was the most important thing to you, wasn't it?
I wouldn't say it's the most important.
Very critical evidence, wasn't it?
It is important evidence in the case, just like anything else may be.
And the reason why, and let's just go through the procedure that you used when you took the DNA testing from the gun. What you did, you put on the gloves,
Yes,
and then you got the swabs out, and you did the swabs for the grip and the other area for the grip, correct?
that is correct.
And then those swabs went separately into a little container to be sent to the lab so that it could be tested separately, correct?
Yes.
And then, I think did you change gloves?
Yes, I typically change gloves.
So what you did is it was so important to make sure that the separation between the grip and the trigger was maintained. You actually even took off your gloves and put on another set of gloves to test the trigger, didn't you?
I always change my gloves every time I do a new swab. It doesn't matter what it is.
And so that's so there won't be any contamination, correct?
That is correct.
Because the last thing in the world you want as an investigator, investigating something serious like someone's death, is to have evidence contaminated, right?
That is correct.
And so what you did was you put on another set of gloves and you tested, you did the swabs on the trigger, correct?
Yes.
And then you put those in a separate container to send it to the lab so that the lab could test on the grip and on the trigger, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Now, did you authorize anybody at the lab to contaminate that evidence and to mix it up?
Objection,
And combine them?
misstatement of evidence, and an assumption of a fact not in evidence that she had authority.
Just asking whether did you give authority to anybody?
Objection, assuming a fact not in evidence.
Let him finish the question. Don't answer until I rule. Go ahead.
Okay.
Did you give instructions to anybody to combine those two samples from the trigger and from the grip? Yes or no?
Sustained.
When you sent those samples off to the lab, you wanted them to be tested separately, didn't you?
Objection as to the relevance as to what she wants.
I'll allow this question. Go ahead.
When you sent those samples off to the lab, you wanted to have them tested separately, didn't you?
I requested just to have them tested, yes, but they are two separate swabs.
Now, when you and Detective Cross got together, however many days it was afterwards, you made a determination about what you'd asked to be tested, correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And fingernails clippings had been taken from Mrs. Ward at the scene, correct?
No.
No, fingernail clippings were not taken at the scene; they were taken later.
That would be the medical examiner's office that does that during autopsy, I believe.
So, did you have any decision about whether or not to decide whether or not there would be tests on the fingernail clippings?
Yes, they were given to me at a later time with all of the evidence from the medical examiner's office.
And at that time, when it was given to you, was it your job to make a determination about whether or not there was going to be further testing on the fingernails?
Yes.
And so you and Agent Cross decided that that wasn't something that you felt was important. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct for this case.
When you went in to the home, and when you examined Mr. Ward and Mrs. Ward, as a matter of fact, you saw no evidence of any defensive wounds, did you?
On which person?
Either one of them.
Well, I couldn't really make an examination properly on Mrs. Ward because I wasn't able to move her hands all the way around to see anything. But no, I did not see any on Mr. Ward.
And if there had been any sort of struggle or scratching, then you could have tested under the fingernails and seen whether or not somebody had gotten scratched or something to that effect, couldn't you?
Yes, in investigations we can do that.
And you didn't see that, obviously, any scratches on Mr. Ward when you examined him or photographed him that night, did you?
That is correct.
So, as a matter of fact, when you were in the room, you saw no evidence of some sort of physical conflict in the room in terms of fighting, like no overturned tables, correct?
At the residence are we talking about?
At the residence, there was no overturned tables in the bedroom, right?
No, there was not in the bedroom.
There wasn't any overturned or thrown or broken lamps or anything like that, correct?
In the master bedroom, no.
Well, when you go out to the patio, you saw what appeared to be some wine and a broken wine glass, correct?
That is correct.
You didn't see any turned over tables or broken lamps or anything like that out in the patio, which would indicate to your experienced eye that there had been some sort of physical struggle out on the patio. Is that right?
Tables being turned or not wouldn't determine yes or no if there's a struggle.
Well, you're looking at the scene, and that what the scene is telling you, you don't have overturned tables, right? You don't, right?
There were no overturned tables.
You don't have overturned chairs, right?
Correct.
You don't have broken lamps or anything like that, correct?
Correct.
Were you aware of whether there was any sort of cleaning or cleaning service of the house? Looked pretty neat and tidy, didn't it?
Yes, the house appeared to be clean and neat.
Okay. So when you're making your assumptions about where people living there and how they may have touched different areas, did you think about a cleaning service or any sort of cleaning that might have gone on in the house?
A cleaning service?
Any people come in and clean houses or clean their own houses. Did it look like it had been cleaned, either by the wards or by somebody else?
The house appeared in clean condition by whoever cleans it, yes.
Well, and in terms of your understanding about whether or not fingerprints would be present or DNA, all that factors in if the house is clean and neat and tidy, isn't it?
It can be a factor, yes.
But just one moment, Your Honor. That's all I have, Your Honor.
Redirect.
Sorry.
Now, hypothetically, if the law permitted you to touch the body at the scene of a suspicious death, would you do GSR testing on somebody with suspected blood on their hands?
No.
Why not?
The suspected blood could contaminate the GSR kit to show that there's no gunshot residue, and specifically if it's an investigation with a gunshot wound victim, you will know that more than likely they will have gunshot residue on them from being shot.
And what, if anything, would it do to any blood pattern on the hands?
If I were to do gunshot residue on a hand that had blood on it, I could destroy any of the types of impressions or patterns from the blood that are on the hands that could be used for expert analysis at a later time.
And what is your new position? What did you transition into doing for the sheriff?
I am a forensics firearms specialist.
All right, so I believe during cross-examination you were talking about the difference between stippling and gunshot residue. Is that accurate?
Yes.
All right. Now, when a gun is discharged, is there gunpowder in a cartridge?
Yes.
And are you aware of what a gunpowder is made out of?
Yes, smokeless powder.
And is that different than what ends up being gunshot residue?
Yes, it's gunshot residue is microscopic pieces of metal and stuff from the actual explosion, and the gunpowder, when it comes out, can cause what would be the stippling effect.
That was my next question. What causes this stippling effect? The unburnt gunpowder or the primer that turns into the gunshot residue?
It would be the unburnt gunpowder that came out and kind of did what they would consider a tattooing. Like if you got a tattoo, that unburnt gunpowder could tattoo the area where the gunshot wound is.
Now, with the blood pattern on Mrs. Ward's face, could you see whether or not she had any stippling or signs of stippling on her face that night?
I could not see that night since I wasn't able to move the victim at all.
And did her clothes, particularly her top that she was wearing, also have blood up on it?
Yes, it did.
So would it be fair to say that the medical examiner would be a better person to ask questions of whether there was stippling on Mrs. Ward or on Mrs. Ward's clothing?
Yes, that would be the determination of the medical examiner.
And again, was there any question that the victim had been shot?
No.
Could you see the entrance wound?
Yes.
Where was the entrance wound?
On her face, I believe by her nose?
And was there any question as to whether or not the defendant had been shot?
No.
And what was the answer? Was he obviously not shot or obviously shot?
Sorry, I meant no, that I did not see any gunshot wounds on the defendant.
And the stippling, can you describe, where does that come from? When a gun is discharged, where is it coming from?
The stippling is coming from the unburnt powder from the firearm. It's coming out the barrel through with the projectile, and it's tattooing. Like if the projectile were to go into your skin here, depending on how close or far away the shooting occurred, would depend on how much stippling you would get.
And does there come a point in time when the distance is so great that there no longer is a stippling effect?
Yes, that is correct.
And if there's a contact wound or a near contact wound, is there a stippling effect?
Yes, a contact wound, you'd have a stippling effect. You could also possibly have the muzzle impression outline on there if it's super complete contact.
So is it fair to say that as you get farther away, the stippling pattern gets wider until there is no stippling pattern?
That would be correct.
And what about the density of the stippling powder pattern? Does that have any relationship to distance from the gun to the wound?
I would assume it would. The closer you are, the more dense stippling you're going to get versus the farther away you are.
Now, on the other hand, let's talk about GSR. Does that exclusively come from the barrel of the gun or not?
No.
Where else does that come from?
In a firearm, it can come from where, per se, the revolver, there's a gap where the cylinder meets the frame. It can come from the cylinder gap. It can come from the back of the firearm. In a revolver, there's another space back there. And then in a regular pistol firearm, as the cartridge ejects out to the side, GSR could come out of that area as well.
So would you expect to see stippling on the hand of the person firing a firearm?
No.
And why is that?
Stippling typically only occurs with a gunshot wound, not actually firing a firearm.
And so therefore, would you expect stippling to be anywhere behind the gun?
No.
Now, the gunshot residue, can that end up being on the hand or hands on the firearm when it's discharged?
Yes.
And is that because, like with this particular weapon, you said there's the cylinder gap?
Yes, with the revolver, there's a cylinder gap, so you have a lot more gases coming out the side of the cylinder, which the GSR is microscopic and small. You're going to get a lot more of that to spread out where the cylinder gap is.
And then are you familiar with a force of nature called gravity?
Yes.
Does gravity have any effect on gunshot residue, no matter how small those particles are?
Yes.
All right. Now, you were asked about sides of the bedroom. When you went into this bedroom, did you see a chalk line or some tape or some sort of barrier going down the middle of this room?
No, I did not.
And you were asked about making assumptions. did you make any assumptions about whether or not either Mr. Ward or Mrs. Ward ever went into that nightstand or not?
No, I did not.
And again, a fingerprint doesn't tell you when it was left, correct?
That is correct.
And then going back to the GSR, the gunshot residue. Is gunshot residue that comes out the barrel the same as the gunshot residue that comes out of the cylinder gap or from the ejection port of a semi-automatic?
Yes, it's going to come out from all areas of the firearm.
I'm asking, is it the same?
Yes,
So there's no GSR type A or GSR type B, it's all the same.
that's correct.
So if somebody is found to have GSR on his or her person, there's no way to tell whether it came out of the barrel of the gun or the cylinder gap or the ejection port.
Yes, there's no way to even determine that the person fired the gun.
Or it was transferred to them.
Correct.
Or that force of gravity pulled it down from somewhere above.
Yes.
And again, we mentioned it earlier, there's no way to date DNA either.
That is correct.
And you made no assumptions that just because the gun ended up in that nightstand or on it as you found it, that that's where it came from.
Yes, I do not know where it came from originally.
Now, you were asked about taking a trigger swab and then swabbing the grips. Do you remember that?
Yes.
All right. Now, you have familiarity with touch DNA. We went over that before this morning, right?
Correct.
Okay. Does the type of surface that one touches have anything to do with the likelihood of whether or not that person would leave DNA on that surface?
Yes, it would work just like a fingerprint, depending on the textured area. If it's very textured, you're going to slough off more skin cells than if it's a smoother surface.
May I approach with 20?
You may.
So, if you could hold the firearm. Can you describe the surface of the trigger?
The trigger is a smooth surface.
And can you describe the texture of the grip of the firearm?
The grip is a textured rubbered surface. There's lots of bumps.
And so the second surface, the grip surface, would be more conducive to touch DNA being left.
I wouldn't want to say for sure yes, but because it is more textured and you have a larger area to hold when holding the firearm, there's a greater chance of getting touch DNA on there than the smaller area of the trigger.
That was my next question. The relative surface areas. Is there a difference in the relative surface area of the trigger versus the grip of the firearm?
Yes, the trigger is a lot smaller, as you can see, versus the grips you put your entire hand on.
And now, as a forensics firearm examiner, have you had the opportunity to fire firearms?
Yes, I do that on a daily basis.
Have you ever had the opportunity to fire a .357 Magnum firearm?
Yes, I have.
Now, when a firearm discharges a projectile out forward,
Your Honor, well beyond the scope of cross-examination, object.
I don't know what the question is yet. Hold on, don't answer until I hear it. Go ahead.
is there any force applied backwards into the person holding the firearm?
I'll allow this.
Objection, Your Honor, outside the scope of cross.
I'll allow this question. Go ahead.
Depending on the type of firearm you're firing and how you're holding it and how strong the person is, you can get a kickback depending on the caliber and the size of the firearm and the size of the person.
And does the type of firearm ammunition affect that?
It can affect that.
Can the weight of the firearm affect that?
The weight of the firearm can affect that as well.
And is a scraping or some sort of touching, some sort of friction event, is that conducive for touch DNA being left?
Yes.
And would you describe the event of firing a firearm to be such a friction event?
Yes, because as you're holding the grips of the firearm, you're bearing down and you want to hold onto the firearm well, because if not, it's just going to go anywhere. You're not going to have that strict, trying to think of the word. You're not going to have a good hold on it, so you're going to have the possibility of it kicking back more if you don't have a good grip on it, which means you're going to be really putting your hand down on there.
Can you demonstrate for the jury how to fire that firearm without holding the grip?
Without holding the grip?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't believe there's a way.
And as you were going through cross-examination with Mr. Gillen, you went through the fact that there were no injuries on either Mr. or Mrs. Ward that indicated any sort of physical struggle.
That is correct.
And aside from the bloodshed event in that room and Mrs. Ward lying down on her side, there was really no signs of furniture being turned over. No material items showed signs of a struggle aside from what was on the patio.
Yes, that is correct.
So to say that another way, was there any signs of a fight for this gun?
There was no tables or chairs turned over to indicate a fight.
Did you see any wine stains anywhere else left in the house other than the bed or in the patio?
Just on Mr. Ward's back.
No other questions?
Mr. Gillen, if you want to cross only on the recoil, I'll let you cross on that.
No, Your Honor, I'm fine.
May this witness be excused.
Thank you.
Mr. Gillen, may this witness be excused? Yes, Your Honor. All right, thank you, ma'am. You are free to go. And this brings us to our afternoon. You're free, yes. And this brings us to our afternoon break. Why don't we take a 15, 20-minute break? Court.
Actually, Your Honor, two issues. We have the photographs, but as you may remember when we had the hearing, I think on the 23rd, that one of the motions in limine we had to do with Mr. Scala and the tests that were run that he conducted, and the court said, well, that would be something that would be deferred to the trial. He's going to be up after this witness.
No, I ruled on the, is this the Stippling test? Yeah, I ruled on that. I said that it went to the weight of the evidence and that, if something strange, or, something changed during trial, I would, revisit the ruling, but I ruled the Stippling test in.
Oh, I don't remember that, but
That was just an oral pronouncement from the bench. It was a lot of motions that day.
it was a lot of motions.
So we're down to the photographs that the state wishes to use as a demonstrative aid, which were the ones that Mr. Cross was identifying this morning. Detective Cross was identifying this morning. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
What's your objection, Mr. Gillen?
My objection is that the test that was taken, the photographs, there was a it does not accurately depict what was actually photographed. There was a change to the resolution of the photographs, and therefore the photographs do not accurately depict what is shown therein. They have been altered. It's very simple. They have been altered.
Well, altered to me means that they changed the image. In other words, that if a person had, for example, black hair, they changed it to red hair. My understanding of the testimony this morning, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that they blew what I would call, they blew up the image. They made it larger. Is that what you're talking about?
Two things. One, I think they actually downsized it, but at least at the last proceeding. But I'm practicing.
I'm just working on this proceeding.
And also altered the resolution. And so I think that's what happened. There was an alteration of the resolution. That's the problem.
Are these photographs any different than what was introduced at the first trial? Not that any of us
I
participated
don't
in the
believe
first
they
trial
were.
other than Mr. Ward.
This
did
issue
it?
was raised at the first trial.
Right, and under Florida case law, unless you can show me that somehow or other they've changed it from the original, if all they've done is blow it up or sharpen it or without actually changing the image, then it's admissible as a demonstrative aid. It's actually admissible into evidence, even though the state's telling me they're not admitting it.
Well, I stand on my objection and understand your
Sure.
ruling, but
State, is anything different about this photograph, these photographs from the last go around?
I never found his deposition. There's instances of that in the records that were created in my office. That's another day. So I don't know if he gave a deposition. I think there was maybe a pretrial motion about it. I didn't have that transcript. I just have his trial testimony, and it didn't look like it came up during the trial. I have the digital photographs, and obviously before we even get to that point of showing it to the jury, I'm going to ask him about those. So I mean, we can proffer it before they come back in with him, because I think what it was, they made these huge blow-ups, which I got out of the
Right.
clerk of the court. They came over and they saw them, but I'm using the digital photographs.
Are the huge blow-ups available?
Yeah.
Are you saying that you want them to use the huge blow-ups, not the digital?
no, what I'm saying is we're on two different issues. We're talking about the size, and we sort of moved past that, and we're talking on
All right, well, hold it, because the record's going to get hopelessly confused. Let's start with this. Are you requesting that the original blown-up photographs be used as the demonstrative aid?
no.
No, okay.
I am stating, and this comes from page 1541 of the prior
Hold on, let me get to that.
proceeding.
1541, you said?
Yes, ma'am, 1541.
Okay. Go ahead.
Beginning on line 16, question, and the resolution can be brightened or darkened from time to time, right? I may have used in the wrong term, but you can make your picture look brighter or darker. Yes. Was any of that done? Yes. Question. Okay, so we see in this picture something that might not be, even if you could see it with the naked eye, that have been enhanced for us to see it in another way. Answer, if you consider lightening and darkening and cropping enhancements, then yes. So what I'm saying is that the photo that he took has been altered, and that is what my objection goes to. It's
Not whether he uses digital or the original.
no,
Okay.
it's the fact that the image itself is not what the photograph showed. It has been altered, and he says it's been altered.
All right. Mr. J, response?
I think, as the court said, it has to be a meaningful alteration if there is one. What these photographs are being used to depict is the extent, the distance that for lack of a better term, the fiery event of the gunpowder still burning in air until the ambient air cools it off. It's just showing in a series of photographs the distance that it goes, as well as the projectile going at different clips, obviously very, very small fractions of a second. And I think under the case law, those sorts of alterations, if they were made to these digital photographs, I don't know if he and I are on the same page, like these are altered like the blow-ups were, or if these are the unaltered images until he sees them.
Why don't we find out before he gets on the stand? So let's bring him in here, please,
Sure.
just for a quick proffer.
Leonard Wolf, guy on the left.
All right, quick proffer, just on this issue, please.
May I remain seated?
Yes, sir.
All right, Mr. Wolf, can you
Yes.
tell us your name?
Leonard Wolf,
Can you spell your first and last name?
Leonardwolf.
Where do you work?
I work at the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner Department.
And what do you do there?
I'm a forensic photographer supervisor.
And do you have the means and capabilities of doing forensic photography of a firearm being discharged?
Yes, I do.
And were you asked by Detective Brian Cross to photograph a .357 Magnum being fired?
Yes.
Did he come down to Miami-Dade's, well, where in Miami-Dade was this done?
At the Medical Examiner Department, 1851 Northwest 10th Avenue.
And were you able to mount this firearm into something secure and photograph firing it.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to show you a series of 6 images, I believe, from what has been marked for identification purposes as AT for identification. This image ends in 001.jpg. Are you familiar with this image?
Yes. Yes.
Image 2,
Yes.
image 3,
Yes.
image 4,
Yes.
image 5,
Yes.
image 6.
Yes.
All right, now, how were these images photographed? Was it used with traditional photography means or digital photography means?
Well, it was
Or is it-
traditional digital photography, but it's a special technique to capture a high-speed event, a bullet in mid-flight. We use a very specialized flash in order to do so.
Now, were those 6 images, did you alter or modify them in any way through electronic means or any other means?
No.
Okay. So during the first proceeding of this trial, there was talk about either lightening or darkening or reducing or enlarging. These digital images that we just looked at, did any of that occur to those images?
Oh, yes. We sometimes need to lighten or darken or sometimes resize images, but nothing was altered in terms of changing the image, in terms of altering it or manipulating it. I guess I misunderstood your question. Sorry.
All right. Well, just so we're all using the same words,
Yep.
what, if anything, was done with these images to change them from their original state?
First thing we do, we take the images off of the digital card. We run an inventory to show all the images that were taken off of the card. Each image is given a hash file, which is a long string of numbers, so that at any point in time we could run a hash file to show that nothing has been altered or changed from the original. We then took those images in a program called Adobe Photoshop, where we converted them from a raw file into a compressed version that we could use for printing. And we did, I believe, lighten the prints a little bit in order to show a little bit more detail.
And did the lightening either extend or decrease the protruding fire event of the burning gunpowder?
No.
Did it change or alter the size or the location of the projectile in the various frames?
No.
So if I understand you correctly, you just lightened it somewhat, but it didn't change the size or the shape of the unspent gunpowder being burnt?
No.
And it didn't change the projectile's location or its size?
No.
And there was a yardstick there,
Yes.
and was that yardstick, as standard as you find anywhere?
It's a standard yardstick, and we include it in the photograph so that we can make a one-to-one photograph if we need to.
All right. And so if you compressed this file so that it could be printed, as opposed to, I guess what you mean, like, how you have to use the slide bar to slide left and right and up and down to see a complete whole image. If it's a really, really big image, sometimes you have to reduce it so that it'll fit on one screen. Is that what you were talking about doing, or?
No. When I said compressed, I meant we took it from a raw image format. When we took the original picture, it was in a raw file format, which is a very large file, very high quality, lots of detail. When I said I compressed it, I meant I converted it into a JPEG file. I don't really remember if we made one-to-ones, but if we do, then we have to either reduce or enlarge the size of the image so that the tick marks on the ruler and the scale that was in the photograph would match a scale in real life, so that the photograph is exactly 1-to-1, life size.
All right, and so if the purpose of these photographs is to show the horizontal extent of the burning event of the unburnt gunpowder, as well as where the projectile is in relationship to the yardstick below it, nothing was done to alter any of that.
No.
You
No
have
more
any questions,
questions.
Mr. Gillen?
Yeah, sure.
Just on this topic?
Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon.
You indicated, let's get down to it, that you did alter the photograph in terms of the image by lightening it to get more detail. Is that what you said?
Yes.
So explain to us, first of all, why you did that.
When I looked at the image on the screen, or when I went to make a print, it looked a little dark, so we just lightened it a little bit to make it.
So the actual image that was taken by your equipment, highly sophisticated equipment, you thought it wasn't acceptable. Is that right?
It was acceptable, it just looked a little bit dark. Sometimes on the camera or on the computer in our gun range, and we bring it back to another monitor that isn't quite calibrated. We just need to make some very fine adjustments, just a little bit.
So the photograph that we just saw here, that's not actually the image that was captured during the test, correct?
It is the image that was captured during the test.
Well, it's not, the image was darker than that from your camera, correct?
Slightly darker, yes.
And what you did, because you thought, at least for whatever reason, you felt as though it needed to be changed, and so you enhanced it by lightening it up, correct?
As far as I remember, yes.
All right. And you also, you indicated a few minutes ago that you did that to try to get more definition, more detail.
Just to make it a little bit lighter, easier to see, yes.
And when you light it up, it looks a lot, these are very bright, aren't they?
When you say these, what are your...
The photographs that we've seen, the images are very bright, correct?
They are an accurate representation of the subject. They look very closely to what it looked like on the
Very
computer.
closely, but not exactly correct because it's been altered, right?
I would say they look exactly correct to me. We have to lighten sometimes just a little bit, so I didn't really change it in any way other than just slightly lightening it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You admit you lightened it for a purpose to try, and so it's not exactly the image that was taken in the photograph, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I have to write.
Anything else on this?
No, ma'am.
All right, any further argument, Mr. Gillen, other than what you've already stated to the court?
I couldn't choose ruling.
Do you have any further argument other than what you've already stated
No,
to the
Your
court?
Honor.
All right, based on the witness's testimony, it appears that nothing that was done to these photographs alters the results of the test or would in any way mislead the jury as to how far the projectile went, what the GSR, well, not the GSR, but there's gunpowder coming off the back, and then there's the gunpowder coming towards the front after it's fired. So based on Florida case law, I think that the state's well within their rights to use this. And of course, defense can cross-examine. This all goes to the weight, not whether or not it can be used as an aid. All right, let's just go ahead and leave him on the stand as opposed to taking him off, bringing him back on. And let's bring the jury back in. State recognized presence of the jury.
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, have a seat, everyone. Ms. Wolf, if you'd stand and raise your right hand, please. State, you may inquire.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you tell us your name and spell your first and last name?
Leonard Wolf, Leonardwolf.
And where do you work, sir?
I work at the Miami-Dade County Medical Examiner Department.
And what do you do for them?
I'm a forensic photographer supervisor.
And what's your background, training, and experience in the area of forensic photography?
I started in 1996 as a student intern at the Medical Examiner Department. It's a 6-month internship program. It covers autopsy photography, crime scene photography, alternate light source, portrait photography, all types of photography related to photographing and documenting evidence. It's a 6-month internship, and shortly after that I was hired full-time. I've been there ever since. I've been there for 22 years.
And did you get involved with a Detective Brian Cross from the Orange County Sheriff's Office who was requesting, or perhaps somebody else did, but he was sent down to you to do some forensic photography with a firearm?
Yes.
And this was many moons ago.
Yes, it was.
Right. And were you able to help him?
Yes.
May I approach?
You may.
What I'm showing you is states 20. Does this appear to be the firearm that you did some forensic photography with?
Yes.
And did he bring some ammunition with him?
Yes.
And do you have a mechanism where you put the firearm into something that secures it so that it won't move and then pulls the trigger for you?
We secure it in
describe it for me?
Yeah, it's called a ransom rest. It's basically a vise that holds the gun in place. It doesn't necessarily pull the trigger for you. You have to kind of pull it manually. But it does hold it in place. It has springs so that it reacts very much to the I guess the backfire of the weapon, just like as you were holding it, so it's consistent.
I'm showing you AB for identification. Does this appear to be ammunition that was brought down there to be used? I know there's no way you can, but does it appear to be similar to that?
Yes, it does.
And do each of these cartridges have their primer pin struck? They've been struck.
Yes, they do.
At this time, the state would move AB for identification into evidence.
Any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
No objection? This will be received, I lost track. This will be received as State's Exhibit 41 without objection.
Now, can you describe the photography process of photographing a firearm in the act of firing?
Yes, to capture a high-speed event like a projectile in mid-flight, it's a little bit different than conventional photography. We use a very specialized flash in order to freeze the action of the projectile in mid-flight. So we use a standard camera, and we use a high-speed flash, which has a very, very short duration. If we were to use conventional photography, a conventional flash like we have on our normal cameras, and we were to photograph a projectile in mid-flight as it's traveling very fast, about 1,500 feet per second, with a standard flash we would just get a long streak, a blur about a foot long. We have a very special flash that has a duration of 1/2 millionth of a second. So as the projectile is traveling and the flash goes off, it freezes it in mid-flight, and you can see it in very high detail. So what we do is we turn off all the lights in the room. It's a completely dark room, no light at all. We have a sensor that's right above the path of the projectile that's connected to the flash. And as the projectile is traveling along, the sensor senses that there's a bullet there, and it sends a signal to the flash. The flash goes off, it lights the gun and the projectile, the soot, the stippling, everything that's coming out, and that's what freezes it in motion. Once the shutter closes, then we can turn on the lights and look at the image.
And do you take more than one image per shot, or do you take several trigger pulls? How did you make these images that we're about to look at?
Each of these images is a still photograph, so it's not like it's a motion picture camera and we took a frame from the beginning, the middle, and the end. Each one of these is one photograph and a separate projectile for each photograph.
Okay. And was it set to go off at the same fraction of a second, or was it any different for each of the shots?
We moved the sensor for each of the shots. We moved the sensor a little bit closer or a little bit farther in order to get the projectile at different distances away from the muzzle.
All right. And we just had an opportunity to go through these 6 images outside the presence of the jury. Do those images fairly and accurately represent the testing that you did that day with Detective Cross?
Yes, they do.
Now, did you do anything to enhance the quality of the photographs?
We lightened them just a little bit before the printing process.
Did this lightening do anything to change the distance of the flare, for lack of a better term at this point, coming from the barrel of the gun?
No.
So it didn't do anything to change its size or anything like that?
No.
Did it do anything to change the size or location of the projectiles?
No.
And was there a yardstick underneath this starting at the edge of the barrel of the firearm?
Yes, there was.
Your Honor, at this time the state would ask to use AT to publish as a demonstrative aid to the jury.
Any other objections?
No other objections, right?
Granted.
May I be seated?
You may. All right, it's up on the juror screen.
All right, so this is a file ending in 001.jpg. Can you describe what we're looking at here?
Okay, we're looking at the photograph that was taken on the day that Brian Cross came down. The weapon is in the ransom rest that I described here on the left. Can I use a pointer or no?
On the screen, if you hit the arrow at the top, it'll pull up a menu for you to be able to draw.
Okay.
And you just drag it.
Okay. So the weapon is right here in the ransom rest. This is the gun right here. This is muzzle flash. There's the projectile right there. And these tiny spots of white specks are pieces of gunpowder. This right here is the sensor that I described that picks up the shock wave that sends a signal to the flash. And this is the scale down here that is lined up with the tip of the muzzle.
And those particles of gunpowder, are you familiar with a term called stippling?
Yes.
And what causes the effect of stippling on the recipient of the stippling?
Pieces of burnt and unburnt gunpowder that are coming out of the weapon along with the projectile leave marks on the skin. Depending if it's burning or if it's burnt or unburned, it would leave different colored marks, black or red.
And so it could burn, but also leave what I believe the people in your building would call an abrasion? Or do you not know?
I think we call it stippling.
Okay.
Yeah.
Image ending 002.jpg. What are we looking at?
Yes. Same setup. It's just that the projectile is a little bit farther from the muzzle, I don't see the sensor, so that means that we just moved the sensor a little bit farther away, and that's why the projectile is a little bit farther from the muzzle.
Now, if something is close enough to what has been illuminated in this image, can that thing or person be burned separate from the stippling? Or do you not know?
If I understand you, if somebody was maybe touching this muzzle flash, would they be burned? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, within the range of this light, as opposed to the darkness here, does that cause a burn separate and apart from stippling or not, or do you not know?
Your Honor, I would object unless the foundation is laid to expertise.
Start with, does he know?
Do you know?
As far as I know, it's very hot, and it would cause a burn. I've seen many gunshot wound injuries that have soot and burning on the skin that would be caused from that.
Image 003.jpg?
Same thing. It's just the sensor is actually, I don't really remember where the projectile was lined up, if it was closer or farther, but the projectile right now is lined up around 12 or 13 inches.
Okay. And so can one see the difference in the extension of this light event based on the distance of the projectile from the barrel? Like from one image to the next, can you compare the distance of the projectile and the size of the light event?
As far as I understand, the light event is going to be pretty much the same for all of these. I mean, there's going to be slight differences, but the light event is happening during the time that the shutter is open. The projectile is being frozen by the flash, but the light event is actually ambient light that's happening during the time of the exposure. So I think it should be pretty similar throughout the series.
All right, and image 4, the projectile appears to be further out.
Yes.
Still farther in 5.
I'm sorry, I didn't see where it was lined up with 4.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's
Let's go
okay.
back. With 4,
Yeah, it's about 19 or 20, and then, yes, a little bit farther,
all right.
20, 20.
And then in 6, what are we looking at here?
This is just the weapon in the vise, no projectile. It's just to show the weapon.
Okay. I have no other questions. Thank you.
Cross?
Just a few, Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Just a few questions. Now, you're basically the photographer down there, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
one of the.
Well, I mean that's your job is to do exactly what you did here. That you're the photographer of this high speed
Yes.
photos, and I think you did indicate that these photos that we've seen, they're not exactly the way that they came out of the machine. That you did change them a little bit by lighting them up, correct?
Yes.
Okay. In addition, when the ammunition that was used in the gun, you don't know whether that was the ammunition that came from the ward home or not, do you?
No, I don't.
Okay. And when you have different types of ammunition, then you're going to get different sorts of visual effects or the energy and the light coming out of the gun, aren't you? It's going to be different.
Yes.
So as a matter of fact, even if you have ammunition from the same manufacturer with the same brand made at different times, they can perform differently, correct?
Yes.
And manufactured ammunition from different lots will perform differently too, even made by the same manufacturer.
Yes.
That's all I have, Your Honor.
Redirect?
No, thank you. He can be excused.
All right. Thank you, sir. You're free to go.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Gregory Scala? Scala?
You may inquire.
Good afternoon, sir. Can you tell us your name?
Greg Scala.
And what do you do for a living now?
I'm retired.
What did you do before you retired?
I worked as a firearms examiner at the Orlando Crime Lab.
How long were you a firearms examiner at the Orlando Crime Lab?
I was an examiner for about 25, 30 years.
And when we say Orlando Crime Lab, does that have a relationship to something called the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
Yes, we were a function of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
All right. And what is your background in education and training and experience and anything else that prepared you to be a firearms examiner? And then briefly go into any continuing training and education you did over your 25, 30 years.
Certainly. I received a Bachelor of Science in Microbiology from the University of Central Florida. And after graduating, I started working at the laboratory in the microanalysis section, which is not related to firearms. But then after 5 or 6 years, I transferred to the firearms section and underwent basically on-the-job training in forensic firearms identification. And that was about a 2-year period.
And for 2 years, was that the amount of time you had to do on-the-job training before you were allowed to do your own course or own casework?
Yes.
And did you have any continuing requirements to maintain your ability to do independent casework?
Yes, there's a lot of continuing courses, conferences, and seminars which I attended through the years. I'm a distinguished member of the Association of Firearms and Toolmark Examiners, and they had an annual seminar which I attended many of those. And that was very specialized courses and seminars at the association meetings.
During the course of your career, did you ever have the opportunity to give opinion testimony about firearms and tool marks and whatnot?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
I don't know. It's in the hundreds of times.
Were you ever not allowed to give opinion testimony in these areas?
I don't recall the time, no.
And have you fired a wide variety of different firearms?
Yes, I have.
Handguns
Yes.
in the forms of revolvers and semi-automatic pistols?
Yes, many.
Shotguns?
Shotguns, rifles.
Okay. Is there anything else?
Well, we only deal with small arms, so to speak.
Okay. All right.
Handguns, shotguns, rifles. We don't deal with military weapons,
Okay.
machine guns, that sort of thing.
Fair enough. May I approach with 20?
You may.
I'm going to ask you if you recognize what has come into evidence as States 20, formerly marked as P for identification.
I recognize the box, the packaging, my laboratory case number and initials are on it. Can I look inside? You might want to
Absolutely, it's in
examine
evidence.
The interior.
And if you want gloves, you're more than welcome.
Yes, I recognize this exhibit.
And what do you recognize it as?
It's a .357 Magnum revolver, Smith & Wesson revolver.
And did you do any work with this particular firearm?
Yes, I did. I examined it extensively for function, and I test fired it many times.
Okay. And you can leave it there for now.
Okay.
Tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury how it is a particular piece of evidence in a box like that gets to you once it's been delivered to the reception area of the Florida Department of Law Enforcement.
Well, this evidence is confiscated in association with a crime, with a criminal matter, by any local agency, say in this particular case, it's the Orange County Sheriff's Department. It was confiscated during a criminal activity and then packaged and submitted to the laboratory for examination, and along with specific requests for the examination.
Okay. And so how is it that you get a particular piece of evidence to begin your casework? Does somebody bring it to you? Do you come and get it? Where is it stored? Can anybody get in there? Those sorts of things.
Oh, okay. Now you want the logistics, the actual It's submitted to the evidence section of the laboratory, which, we follow all evidence protocols, chain of custody and all this stuff. And then I pick up the evidence from the evidence section at the laboratory when I'm ready to work the case. And then it's in my custody during the entire examination process. And then when I'm done with my examination, it's then returned to the evidence section, which then notifies the agency that it's ready for pickup.
And is the FDLE lab in Orlando itself certified by any certifying agency?
Yes, they are accredited by ASCLD.
And what does ASCLD
That's
stand
the
for?
American Society of Crime Lab Directors. It's the agency which gives accreditation and inspects the lab and gives them annual accreditation.
And as you were saying, does the lab have to maintain certain protocols, for preventing contamination, security, those sorts of things to maintain that certification?
Yes, we do.
All right. Now, let's talk about this particular firearm. What kind of firearm is it?
It's a .357 Magnum revolver. It's double action only.
Now, let's break down these words. Revolver, what does that mean?
A revolver is a handgun that has a cylinder which revolves.
And you can demonstrate. They can see
Okay.
it.
This is the cylinder, and in the cylinder are the cartridges. A cartridge is the ammunition component of all firearms. This particular revolver holds 5 cartridges. So there's 5 chambers in the wheel when it's fully loaded. There's 5 cartridges in each chamber when it's fully loaded. Now this lock here prevents it from closing, but it's loaded by opening, and then you insert the cartridges in each chamber, and then you close it.
Now, you said the word double action. Can you explain double action, single action, and internal hammer, external hammer, those sorts of things for us?
Well, yes. Double action, it's called double action because it accomplishes 2 things when you pull the trigger. It cocks the hammer and it releases the hammer. Single action, you have to manually cock the hammer with your thumb. So it only accomplishes one thing when you pull the trigger, and that's releasing the hammer. That's why it's called single. But
Now,
there
can
is
you
no
see the
single
hammer on
action
this firearm?
because the hammer is internal.
Okay.
It's concealed, so you cannot physically cock it.
So there's no way to accidentally cock the hammer in this particular firearm.
No.
All right. So now let's talk about trigger pull. Can you explain that term to the jury?
Certainly. Trigger pull is the amount of force we measure in pounds that it takes to release the hammer.
And did you test this particular weapon to see what its trigger pull range was?
Yes, I did.
How do you go about doing that?
You basically suspend weights from the trigger and add or remove weights in successive amounts to get hammer fall or hammer release.
And what was the bottom and high end range?
The minimum amount was 12.25 pounds, and that is at 12.25 pounds, it will lift the weight without releasing the hammer, and at 12.5 pounds, it released the weight. So
would
it's
you
somewhere between 12.25 and 12.5 pounds.
Now, in the wide range of different firearms that you've inspected, fired, and tested over the course of your career, would you describe 12.5 to 12.25, well, 12.25 and 12.5 as high, medium, middle of the road, low trigger weight?
For double action, that's pretty normal. Because
Okay.
double action, I said, as I explained earlier, it requires both to cock the hammer and to release the hammer. So it takes more force in double action. So 12.25 to 12.5 is a fairly normal double action. It might be a little high, but it's fairly normal.
Now, what would be the typical range for single action?
Single action can go anywhere. Now, it depends on if you're a very knowledgeable enthusiast and you like a light trigger pull and you know what you're doing. They can be as low as 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds single action, but that's really kind of unsafe if you don't know how sensitive this trigger is. I would say a safe trigger pull action would be between 2.5 to 3.5 pounds, and that's pretty typical on single action trigger pulls.
Okay. All right. Now, Did you test fire this weapon?
Yes, I did.
Now, I guess let me back up and ask you, what did you do first? What did you do second? Now, the trigger pull, where did that fall in? When did you test the trigger pull, before or after test firing?
Well, I do a mechanical evaluation of the firearm initially to make sure that it's safe to test fire.
All right, tell us about that.
Well, you just examine the gun, take notes as to the type of action it is, and measure barrel length, and measure and what are the safety mechanisms, and do they function, and that sort of thing. And to make sure, and you also physically examine the gun for any cracks or any weaknesses in the firing chamber that would make it unsafe to fire.
Did this firearm appear to be in a state of good repair and safe to fire?
Yes.
All right, after examining this firearm, what was your next step?
Then I would test fire the gun. After the preliminary exam, I'd test fire the gun using ammunition similar to what was submitted with the gun.
And is that just to see if the weapon will fire?
It's to see if the weapon will fire, but it's also to collect test-fired exhibits from the gun, what we call known exhibits, for future comparison purposes.
And did you ever weigh this particular firearm?
No, I didn't actually weigh how much it actually weighs. No, that's not one of our normal
Okay.
things that we do.
And how long is the barrel? Did you measure that?
I think I did. It's less than 2 inches, 1.75 inches or something in that neighborhood.
And does the length or lack of length of the barrel affect the weight of the firearm?
Yes, yes, it does.
How would you describe the weight of this particular firearm in relative terms?
It's a pretty light. It's fairly light.
Now, the process of firing a gun, can you take us through that? What actually happens mechanically in the gun and then in the cartridge?
Well, if you mean generally all guns, there's a firing.
This gun.
This particular gun, it's double action only. The process merely consists of assuming that those 5 cartridges were loaded in all the chambers of the gun. If that's the case, all you have to do is pull the trigger.
Okay. And so inside of the gun, my understanding of it is there's a teeny little pin that strikes the back of the cartridge. Is that fair?
Well, there is a firing pin.
All right. Tell us about the firing pin and then what that causes the cartridge to do.
Okay. Well, I said to fire the gun, all you have to do is pull the trigger, but there's a lot happening internally in the gun. The trigger is connected to a sear, which is connected to the hammer, which is connected to a spring, which gives the hammer force to fall. Now, the sear is what holds the hammer at the cocked position. And in a single action revolver, the sear holds it cocked so that all you have to do is pull the trigger, and releasing the sear causing the hammer to fall. But this has no sear because it's a double action only. So when you pull the trigger, it's connected directly to the hammer, which causes it to cock, so to speak. And then it reaches the point to where the sear releases, and then the hammer falls.
Okay. And then when the hammer falls, it strikes the cartridge.
Now, the hammer is fairly heavy in terms of mass, but the tip of it's sharp. The tip is called the firing pin. That's fairly sharp and small, so that it can go through the aperture in the breech face of the firearm to strike the primer on cartridges.
And what is the primer?
The primer is an explosive charge at the base of a cartridge that ignites the gunpowder and causes the cartridge to discharge.
And what does the primer consist of?
It's an explosive. It's like a disc shape, a very small disc shaped object that has an anvil, and the anvil is where the explosive mixture is residing, so that when the firing pin strikes the outer portion of the disc of the primer, it crunches the explosive and causes ignition. This explosive is a contact explosive, so to speak. It explodes by friction and not by heat.
And this primer, does that have any relationship with something called gunshot residue?
Yes, it does.
And what is that?
Gunshot residue is a forensic term we use describing the smoke or the cloud that envelops the firearm after discharge. And these are submicroscopic particles that are produced during the discharge of the firearm, which are deposited on surfaces around the firearm.
And are they made up of any particular elements?
Well, they're made up of a lot of elements, but what we look for when we're examining for gunshot residue are barium and antimony, because the barium and antimony are from the primer portion of the cartridge.
That's what I was getting at. So the primer consisted of those heavy metals that you've just described.
Yes.
And where does the gunshot residue of these heavy metals, where does that come out of the firearm?
Comes out primarily the barrel, but on the revolver, it also comes out of, there's a gap between the cylinder and the barrel. This is the barrel and this is the cylinder. There's a gap. And gases can escape from that gap during discharge, or they do escape from that gap.
And once they escape, are they subjected to the forces of nature like gravity?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's talk about what else is in this cartridge besides the primer. When the primer, through this contact friction, explodes, is there anything else that ignites?
Yes, there's gunpowder in the cartridge.
And what is gunpowder made up out of generally?
Gunpowder is generally made of nitrocellulose. That's an explosive.
Is that an organic compound
It is an organic compound.
as opposed to a heavy metal compound like the primer?
Well, the primer has heavy metals in it, but there is some organic component to it, but it's primarily
Okay.
a inorganic explosive.
Does the primer cause this gunpowder to explode?
Yes.
And by exploding, does that produce gas? Does it change matter from the solid state to the gas matter?
Yes, in a very rapid manner.
And do you have any idea approximately the volume of this gas that gets created, particularly with the 357 Magnum cartridge?
No, I don't.
Okay. And so we go from the primer to the gunpowder. Is there another part of the unspent cartridge that we haven't talked about?
Yes, the most important part is the bullet.
All right, and what is that? Well, generally speaking, what is that made of? And then let's talk about the bullets that were in this gun.
Okay, bullets are generally made of lead.
And can they sometimes be surrounded by something else?
Yes, and they could be jacketed in brass or copper
Okay.
or steel, but generally copper or brass.
Can they come with solid cone heads or hollow point?
There's all sorts of things, all sorts of configurations.
Well, let's talk about the configuration of the 4 live rounds that were submitted with this particular firearm. And may I approach with 21?
You may.
Tell us about the particular projectile that's made up of this cartridge.
This particular cartridge is marketed as Golden Saber by Remington. It's called Golden Saber because the bullet is a jacketed hollow point, and the jacket is made of brass. And that gives it its golden cast, if you will. But it's also has a hollow point. It has a very wide hollow point. In the hollow point, there's notches at the rim of the hollow point, and these notches are at an angle. And the purpose of this is most hollow point bullets, when they strike their target, they mushroom, they expand, and this is what's called mushrooming. This particular bullet is designed to not just mushroom, but the angle at the angled notches at the nose cause it to mushroom and the jacket to expand and kind of rip around the surface of the bullet, but it exposes the inside of the jacket, which is like teeth. And when it opens up, it's like these teeth open up outward to cause additional damage.
Does the design of a firearm, in particular this firearm, is there anything that is done to try and help the projectile fly straight in its flight path?
Yes, the whole theory of accuracy in firearms is based on rifling in the barrel.
Can you tell the jury about that?
Firearm barrels, just about all firearms except shotgun barrels have rifling. Rifling are spiral-shaped grooves cut into the barrel to impart a spin on the projectile after it's fired. This spin is called, what we call it, gyroscopic stability. If you know a gyroscope, if you've ever played with the gyroscope, the spinning of the gyroscope gives it stability so you can't tip it over. Well, a bullet has the same gyroscopic stability so that it keeps it true in its path. Wind does not affect it as much. And so it flies straighter and more accurate due to this gyroscopic stability.
Now, once a bullet strikes something other than air, can it begin to have new movement either on the X, Y, or Z plane? Can it end up tumbling, anything like that? Can you explain that to the jury?
Yes, that can happen. If it strikes like a solid surface, it can disrupt its stability and cause it to spin or tumble.
And can that disruption in the straight flight path actually cause more damage when it's a person or a thing that's being struck?
Well, yes, that's true. If the bullet strikes a person and it's not flying straight on, it hits the person in a profile, so to speak, then that would cause more initial impact damage because there's more surface area contacting, as opposed to if the bullet hits a person straight on, it's going to penetrate more and maybe do less damage if it penetrates and goes through the victim.
And do you have a range of speed that a projectile fired from a 357 Magnum cartridge from a 1.75-inch barrel 357 Magnum, is there a range of speed in terms of foot per second, miles per hour, or that metric system those other countries use? Do you know?
I would say, I don't know the exact figures, but I'd say it's anywhere between 17 to 2,200 feet per second. Quite fast, a 357 Magnum.
That's what I was going to ask you. In terms of comparisons to other firearm and other types of ammunition, is this relatively fast, relatively
Yes,
in
it
the
is.
middle?
In terms of, well, you have to understand that there's the whole plethora of calibers and ammunition and different cartridges with different calibers. There's a lot out there. In terms of 38 357, this is a very fast cartridge, but the shorter barrel, understand, will rob some of the speed from it. You could use the same cartridge and a longer barrel revolver and get more velocity out of it.
Is that because the shorter barrel doesn't allow as much of the gunpowder to burn?
That's correct.
And so does that mean that there's more unburnt powder that comes out?
In a shorter barrel, yes.
Okay. And what is unburnt gunpowder called when it strikes something and leaves a mark?
Well,
Or let
the
me strike
term-
that. Are you familiar with the term called stippling?
yes, that's what I was going to say. The term stippling is referred to the pattern produced by the unburnt gunpowder.
All right. Now, with a particular weapon such as that 357 Magnum short barrel, are you familiar with the range of distance that stippling can come from the barrel of that firearm?
I know, yes, the approximate range.
And what's the approximate range just based on your experience over the years?
You would expect to see gunpowder projected maybe 3 to 4 feet.
Okay. And beyond that, if the gun is fired farther away than 3 to 4 feet, you would not expect to see stippling anymore.
You may see a couple of particles that'll travel out beyond 4 feet, but you won't see much of a pattern, a recognizable pattern.
All right, so now let's talk about that. Stippling, the unburnt gunpowder, is that something that exclusively comes from the barrel of the gun, or does that also, like the gunshot residue, come out of the cylinder area or the ejection port in a semi-automatic?
Okay, now you've actually mentioned two separate examination techniques. Gunpowder residue is the pattern that's produced that is projected out of the barrel of a firearm
So the answer to my
onto
question,
the target.
so that's the answer to my question. Unspent gunpowder is exclusively out of the barrel that produces the stippling effect?
That's correct.
It does not come out of the cylinder area or the ejection port.
No, it doesn't.
All right. And now let's talk about, are you familiar with the term density of a pattern?
Yes.
Is there any relationship between the distance from the edge of the barrel of the firearm to what it strikes? Is there a relationship between the density of the stippling powder that you would see, obviously within the distance that there is stippling, of course?
Yes.
What is that relationship?
The farther you get away from the muzzle of the firearm, the less dense the pattern becomes. And if you imagine from the muzzle itself to projecting out, the gunpowder follows a cone-shaped pattern. So if you imagine a reverse cone coming from the muzzle of the firearm, you can imagine how that pattern is distributed in regards to distance.
So like a 3-foot waffle cone for ice cream.
That's correct.
Okay. And so the farther away, is it fair to say the wider the diameter of the waffle ice cream cone?
That's correct.
And the farther away, the less dense the pattern.
Yes,
And then the converse is true. The closer, the tighter the diameter of the pattern,
that's correct.
and the more dense the pattern.
That's correct.
Okay. Now let's get off of this unspent gunpowder. How about GSR? Can that be projected out of the barrel of the gun as well?
It can be.
And is there any distance that it can be projected?
Well, gunshot residue is another story. It doesn't really, it's sort of an atmospheric thing. It depends on the environment you're in, but it doesn't really project. It just sort of is released into the atmosphere, and then the particles eventually settle out. And they settle out on any surface around the discharging gun, and they can be picked up and easily picked up by somebody touching the surface after the fact.
All right, so have you ever seen LeBron James start a basketball game? He throws up, I don't know what it is. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm talking about.
All right. And so it's like a cloud that comes out of what parts of the firearm?
Yes.
What parts?
Well, all the parts of the firearm. It's an
Okay.
explosion. You know, when a cartridge goes off, it's like a firecracker going off. An explosion. Only in a firearm, the explosion is contained in the chamber, and it directs most of the force out of the barrel. But some of it escapes through the cylinder gap. So just imagine an explosion, like when a firecracker goes off, there's smoke everywhere. You can smell it. Well, that's the same thing when a gun goes off. When a gun goes off, you can smell it. You can smell the gunpowder. That's the gunshot residue you're smelling.
Is it fair to say it's a 360-degree event?
Yeah, that's fairly fair to say, yes.
But other, certain portions of this 360 degrees will have more density and less density.
That's correct.
Okay. May I approach?
You may.
I'm giving you States 38. I'm going to ask you if you recognize States 38.
I recognize the packaging. It's not open, so do you want me to open it, or?
Well, how do you recognize the packaging first?
It has our laboratory case number or exhibit number and my initials on it.
Okay. And there's gloves there for you if you would like them, and I'm going to provide you scissors. Would you examine the contents of
Certainly.
38?
Okay.
Do you recognize the contents of States 38?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize them as?
They are fired bullet jacket and a fired bullet core.
Now, were you able to do any comparative analysis with those items to see whether or not they were fired from any particular firearm?
Yes, I did.
How do you go about doing that?
It's a microscopic comparison.
And Tell us how you do it.
Well, I mentioned earlier, we have to test fire the gun to get representatives standards from the gun, which includes firing bullets into water. So the submitted revolver was fired into water and bullets were recovered for a microscopic comparison. And it's those bullets, the standards or the tests representing the revolver that I microscopically compared to this question bullet using a comparison microscope.
And does that have anything to do with the rifling that you were telling us about inside the barrel of the gun?
Yes, the rifling imparts unique marks onto the surface of the bullet, which are then used for the identification process.
Were you able to say whether or not the projectile had a relationship to that gun that was just up on your desk?
Yes, I did.
What's the relationship?
That the bullet jacket was identified as having been fired from
Oh, the
submitted.
jacket, okay.
The bullet jacket was identified as having been fired
Were you
from.
able to compare the projectile?
No,
And
no,
just
the core.
yeah, the
You're-
core?
You're talking about the core.
Right.
The core was not identifiable. The target, the expansion process, which I described earlier, causes a separation of the core and the jacket.
And are you able to tell, you know, the age in terms of how many rounds have been spent out of that firearm based on the quality of the rifling that you saw in the test projectiles?
No.
Okay. You can replace the contents of 38 back into the bag, and I'll take it back from you.
I opened up some of these envelopes. So
That's fine.
I understand
Put 'em back.
the whole open.
Showing you AA for identification. Are you familiar with AA for identification? Little tape.
It says distance test, but it's not actually marked by our lab number.
Okay.
Must have been packaged outside of.
Can you open the package
I'll have
and
to
review it
open
to
and
yourself?
examine it.
Do you recognize the contents of AA?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize them as?
They are cotton twill fabric swatches, which are like 9x9 squares of cotton twill fabric, white cotton twill fabric, which were used to test fire the revolver into it at various distances.
And where was this done?
This is done in the range of the laboratory,
An indoor range?
an indoor range.
All right. Few questions. Obviously, were you able to replicate the exact temperature, barometric pressure, and humidity of the household where the gun was discharged into Mrs. Ward?
No,
These cloth twills, was there any other materials considered for what was done?
that's the standard protocol we use for distance tests is cotton twill, because there's just too many fabrics available, or too many different variables. Firearms discipline has decided to use cotton twill as the standard testing material for all distance tests. Usually our distance tests are referring to gunpowder patterns on clothing.
And so my next question, which you've kind of answered, is cloth twill an accepted
I apologize, I could not hear the last answer.
Can you repeat your answer, please?
The distance tests we generally perform are in reference to a gunpowder pattern on fabric or clothing.
And is that generally accepted within the relevant forensic community of firearms testing?
Well, what's accepted is the cotton twill.
Okay.
It's not just accepted. That's been it's been adopted by the discipline as the only thing to use.
Now, were you able to replicate the three-dimensional shape of Mrs. Ward's face for this test firing?
No.
Is there any way to actually do that?
Well, I guess you could, but it would be kind of a pointless exercise.
Why is it pointless?
Because the distance, you're talking about the difference of a pattern within the depth of a person's face, and the pattern difference isn't going to be that much.
Okay.
There isn't going to be that much variation in the pattern, the density of the pattern, the spread of the pattern, and say the depth of a person's face, 5 or 6 inches. There's not going to be that much difference to warrant that kind of a procedure. And our procedures are standardized procedures which are used universally. So there is no universal procedure for taking a distance test on a three-dimensional surface. There's just too many variables there that it would be totally ridiculous to try and standardize a procedure on a three-dimensional surface.
What distances was the weapon tested at?
There were 4 or 5 different distances: 6, 12, 18, 24, and 30 inches.
And
from the muzzle, the distance from the muzzle.
And was, obviously there's only so many rounds that were found in the firearm.
Yes.
So was other ammunition used primarily, and we'll get to the actual ammunition found in the firearm, but for test firing at each of the distances, were rounds used that were not found within the firearm?
Yes, we used laboratory ammunition for the test fires, but it was the same type of ammunition as was found in the gun.
Okay. And now, can ammunition, even in the same lot, that is the same batch that a manufacturer makes, can there be variations from round to round?
Yes, there can be.
And can there actually be variations from round to round that are chambered at the same time into a firearm from the same lot?
It's possible, yes.
So theoretically, there's no way to identically ensure that even the 4 other cartridges in the firearm as the one that was fired in the night in question are identical.
Right.
All right. So how many rounds did you fire in at each distance with the lab or store ammunition?
Well, there was 3 rounds fired at each distance,
All right.
using mostly laboratory ammunition. I did
Now-
fire a couple of tests using the evidence ammo at select distances.
May I approach?
You may.
What I'm showing you is the larger envelope as into what was in States 20. Can you review what is inside of that?
Fifteen cartridge cases.
And is there labeling on them?
My initials, exhibit numbers, and I guess test numbers. I put test numbers on them.
All right. And would 15 rounds indicate that there was 3 at 6 inches, 12 inches, 18, 24, and 30?
Yes,
So my arithmetic is on.
yes.
All right. You can replace those. Do you recognize the contents of the smaller envelope in States 20?
Yes, I do.
What do you recognize these as?
These are the fired cartridge cases and bullets that I initially test fired the revolver in the lab for the microscopic comparison portion.
And so those projectiles, can I borrow one?
Sure.
Are these the ones that went into the water?
Yes.
And so then you used microscopic comparison to compare the rifling on it to the jacket that was found in Mrs. Ward?
Yes.
Okay. You can replace those. Showing you the State's Exhibit 21, which contains a few different envelopes. Can you look at these two envelopes, tell me if you recognize them and the contents of them?
Okay.
All right, let's start with the one on the right. Did you, did these have anything to do with this distance testing that we're talking about?
Yes, they did.
And what is the relationship to the distance testing?
They were used in the distance testing, and the reason they were used is these cartridges were submitted with the revolver. They were the same ammunition that I used in the distance test, but I wanted to be able to compare and use these cartridges to compare with my ammunition that I used in the distance test to make sure that they were similar, as the same gunpowder.
And at which distances, and first, how many of the live cartridges, or the cartridges that were found in the gun, how many were used?
There were 3 were used.
Okay, and can you empty it out?
Okay, this one, there's 2 here.
And that's what you labeled as K2B and K2C?
Right.
All right, and did you fire, what distances did you fire those 2 cartridges at? And you can refer to your report if you need to.
Yeah, I think it was 18 inches. 18 inches. I don't remember what the other one was. It might have been 2 at 18.
Would it refresh your memory?
Yeah, I'll have to. Pretty sure it's 12 and 18 inches.
Your answer is what? Say it in the mic.
12 and 18 inches.
Okay. Now, at a separate day, did you have anything to do with Special Agent Yesenia Barron firing a round from the into that .357 Magnum?
Yes, I did.
And can you tell me about this envelope labeled K2D?
K2D was used to test fire the revolver in the lab, in the range, for the purpose of swabbing the shooter's hands to do a gunshot residue test.
Okay.
We actually don't swab their hands. We actually
I understand.
stub the hands of the individual for gunshot residue.
Your Honor, at this time, the state would move AA for identification into evidence.
Any objections? All right, this will be received as 42? States number 42 without objection.
May I approach?
You may.
What I'm showing you is AR for identification. With the exception of this larger page, can you tell me if you recognize the other pages in this exhibit?
They look like photocopies of my distance tests.
And who would have made those photocopies?
I believe they were made at the medical examiner's office.
Okay, so they would have done it,
Yes.
not you? Okay. May I have a moment?
You may.
Let me know when you want to scroll down.
Oh, okay.
No, not that high tech, but I can scroll down for you.
Okay. Okay.
Might have copied, made those photocopies?
There's nothing as to where the location where they were made. We might have made them at the lab.
Just calls for yes or no. Does that refresh your memory as to when those copies were made? You still don't know if you had anything to do with it?
Oh, I know I had something to do with it, but I don't know where they were made, whether they were made.
Okay. Let's throw out where they were made. Did you have something to do with doing it?
I'm sure I was involved in it, yes.
Was the copying done on a 1-to-1 scale, or was it enhanced in any way?
Just on a 1-to-1 scale.
No other questions of this witness?
Cross. Let me see the attorneys at sidebar. I caught you all stretching. We're going to take a 10-minute stretch break and then come back and finish with cross this evening. I told you we'd go a little bit late if we had a witness on the stand, so we're going to do that tonight. All right, so 10 minutes so everybody can stretch, and we'll be right back. Thank you.